The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a scythe through wheat, casting shadows that danced across the university's manicured quad. Students scattered like startled birds, their backpacks bouncing as they ran for cover behind oak trees that had witnessed decades of academic routine. But this wasn't routine. This was chaos wrapped in military precision, and at its center stood Sarah Chen, frozen between the library steps and a destiny she'd never imagined. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Black Hawk touched down with mechanical grace, its side door sliding open to reveal 4 figures in tactical gear. Their faces were hidden behind ballistic masks, but their movements spoke a language Sarah recognized from countless late-night gaming sessions. Controlled, purposeful, lethal. The lead operator stepped forward, his boots hitting the pristine walkway with authority that made the campus security guards instinctively step back. "Phoenix," he called out, his voice cutting through the rotor wash with startling clarity. "We need you to come with us." Phoenix, the call sign hit Sarah like a physical blow, sending her laptop bag tumbling from nerveless fingers. Books scattered across the concrete: Advanced Cryptography, Quantum Computing Theory, Introduction to Cybersecurity Ethics. Academic pursuits that suddenly felt as fragile as paper in a hurricane. She'd used that handle in online forums, in competitive programming contests, in the shadowy corners of the internet where she'd honed skills she'd thought were just intellectual exercises. "There's been a mistake," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the mechanical symphony of the helicopter. Around her, the campus had transformed into something from a war zone. Professor Martinez, her favorite instructor in the computer science department, stood slack-jawed near the fountain, his coffee cup tilted at an impossible angle, brown liquid streaming onto his worn leather shoes. Sarah had been walking to his office just moments ago, eager to discuss her thesis proposal on quantum encryption. Algorithms. That conversation felt like it belonged to another lifetime now. The operator, his uniform, bore no visible rank or insignia, but command radiated from him like heat from a forge, took another step forward. Sarah Chen, also known as Phoenix, graduate student in computer science at Georgetown University. Born in San Francisco, moved to Maryland at age 16. Graduated summa cum laude from Thomas Jefferson High School. Currently working on a thesis involving quantum cryptographic applications. His recitation was mechanical, precise, and terrifying in its accuracy. "How do you?" Sarah began, but he continued without pause. 2 weeks ago, you participated in an online capture the flag competition. You didn't just win, you broke the game. Your solution to the final challenge involved creating an algorithm that our best cryptographers estimate should have taken a team of experts 6 months to develop. You did it in 47 minutes. The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. It had been a Friday night, rain pattering against her dorm room window while her roommate Elena was out at some fraternity party. Sarah had been procrastinating on a paper about ethical implications of artificial intelligence, finding refuge in the familiar comfort of code and puzzles. The competition had seemed like harmless fun, a way to test herself against other programmers from around the world. She remembered the final challenge, a multi-layered encryption system that seemed impenetrable at first glance. But Sarah had seen patterns others missed, connections that revealed themselves like constellations emerging from a dark sky. Her fingers had moved across the keyboard with a fluidity that surprised even her, each line of code flowing into the next with an elegance that felt less like programming and more like composing music. "That was just a game," she said, her voice stronger now but still trembling around the edges. "I was just having fun, showing off maybe." "I never thought." "The encryption you broke wasn't fictional," the operator interrupted. "It was a simplified version of a system currently protecting classified military communications across 3 continents. When our systems flagged your solution, every intelligence agency in the free world took notice. You didn't just solve a puzzle, Phoenix. You demonstrated capabilities that could shift the balance of global security. Sarah's legs felt like they might give way beneath her. She grabbed for the library's stone railing, her palms scraping against rough granite that had been worn smooth by countless hands over decades of academic seasons. The texture grounded her, reminded her that this was real, not some elaborate dream brought on by too much caffeine and late-night coding sessions. Students continued to gather at a safe distance, their phones raised to capture footage that would probably be confiscated within the hour. Sarah could see faces she recognized: Marcus from her algorithms class, looking pale and confused. Jennifer from the programming club, her mouth hanging open, in shock. David, the Taya who'd helped her debug a particularly stubborn recursive function. Just last week, they were staring at her like she'd suddenly sprouted wings or begun speaking in tongues. "I'm a student," Sarah said, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. "I have classes. I have a thesis to defend. She gestured helplessly at the scattered books, at the normal life that seemed to be dissolving around her like sugar in rain. The operator's expression remained hidden behind his mask, but something in his posture shifted, became fractionally less rigid. "We know this is overwhelming. We know you didn't ask for this. But sometimes circumstances choose us rather than the other way around." He paused, and Sarah caught a glimpse of eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. 3 days ago, our systems detected a massive cyber attack in progress. Foreign actors have infiltrated defense networks across multiple allies. Traditional countermeasures have failed. The attack vector is based on quantum encryption principles that our current teams can't fully comprehend. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of the world. She'd read about cyber warfare in abstract terms, written papers about theoretical vulnerabilities, and hypothetical defense strategies. But this was real enemies attacking through virtual spaces she'd thought were secure, using weapons forged from the same mathematical principles she'd been studying for years. "We need someone who thinks differently," the operator continued. "Someone who can see patterns that our trained analysts miss. Someone who can break impossible codes because they don't know they're impossible." His voice carried a note of desperation that chilled Sarah more than any threat could have. "We need Phoenix." Behind the operator, the other three Delta Force soldiers maintained perfect stillness, but Sarah could sense their tension. These weren't men accustomed to long conversations or patient recruitment. They were weapons in human form, tools designed for swift action and decisive results. The fact that they were here, on a college campus, asking rather than simply taking, spoke to the gravity of whatever crisis had brought them to her doorstep. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, scenarios cascading through her consciousness, like code compiling in real time. She thought about her parents, Dr. James Chen and Dr. Lisa Wang Chen, both professors themselves, he in electrical engineering at UC Berkeley, she in applied mathematics at Stanford. They'd raised her to believe in the power of knowledge, in the responsibility that came with exceptional gifts. They'd also raised her to be careful, to think before acting, to consider consequences that rippled far beyond immediate actions. What would they say if they could see her now? Their daughter, who'd skipped 2 grades and earned a full scholarship to Georgetown, who'd planned to spend her 20s in graduate school and her 30s building a career in cybersecurity consulting, suddenly faced with a choice that could reshape not just her life, but potentially the security of nations. The campus around them had taken on a surreal quality. Normal sounds, birds chirping, distant traffic, the hum of air conditioning units seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The Gothic architecture of the university, with its stone facades and leaded windows, felt like a stage set for some elaborate play. Sarah had walked these paths hundreds of times, but now they seemed foreign, belonging to a person she was no Longer sure she recognized. What if I say no? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. The operator's pause was brief, but telling. The attack is scheduled to culminate in 18 hours. If successful, it will compromise defense systems protecting approximately 400 million people across NATO countries. Air traffic control networks, power grids, emergency services, nuclear facility safeguards, all could be compromised. Simultaneously. He let the implications sink in before continuing. You're the only person we've found who demonstrated the specific type of analytical capability needed to counter this threat. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of choice settling on her shoulders like lead. She thought about Elena, probably sleeping off last night's party in their shared dorm room, completely unaware that her roommate's weekend plans might determine whether she'd have a functional society to wake up to. She thought about Professor Martinez, still standing by the fountain in shock, and all the other professors who'd nurtured her intellectual growth, never imagining they were preparing her for war. When she opened her eyes, the operator was extending a tablet toward her. The screen showed satellite imagery, network diagrams, cascading data that painted a picture of digital warfare on a scale she'd only imagined in theoretical discussions. Lines of code scrolled past elegant, malicious, and utterly devastating in their potential. "This is what we're facing," he said, "and this is why we need you." Sarah took the tablet with trembling hands, her eyes immediately drawn to the architectural beauty of the attack. It was sophisticated beyond anything she'd encountered in academic exercises, yet she could see the underlying logic, the mathematical principles that governed its operation. Like a complex musical composition, it had themes and variations, recursive patterns that built upon themselves with fractal complexity. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then immediately felt ashamed of the admission. Beauty and destruction were dancing together in the code before her, and she was perhaps the only person present who could appreciate both aspects simultaneously. "Beauty that kills," the operator said grimly. "Can you stop it?" Sarah studied the patterns more closely, her mind automatically beginning to trace potential countermeasures. She could see weaknesses, not many, and none that would be obvious to conventional analysis, but they were there. Quantum encryption might seem impenetrable to classical approaches, but it followed rules, and rules could be understood, exploited, turned against themselves. "Maybe," she said, then corrected herself with growing confidence. Yes, I think I can." The operator nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then we need to go, now." As Sarah looked around the campus one final time, she realized she was memorizing details she might never see again. The way sunlight filtered through the oak leaves, casting dappled shadows on walkways worn smooth by generations of students. The Gothic spires that had watched over decades of young minds discovering their potential. The fountain where she'd sat countless afternoons, debugging code and dreaming about her future in technology. That future was still there, waiting for her, but it had transformed into something far more immediate and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She was no longer just a student with promising grades and ambitious plans. She was Phoenix, a call sign that belonged to someone capable of fighting wars in digital spaces, of standing between civilization and the chaos that could unravel it. The thought terrified her. It also, if she was completely honest with herself, thrilled her in a way that made her question everything she'd thought she knew about who she was and what she wanted from life. The helicopter's interior was sparse, functional, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Sarah found herself strapped into a jump seat between two Delta Force operators who radiated controlled tension like tuning forks struck and held. The one to her left, she caught a glimpse of Torres stenciled on his gear, offered her a headset. With surprising gentleness, his gloved fingers careful not to tangle her long black hair as he helped position the microphone. "First time flying military?" he asked through the COM system, His voice crackled but warm with what might have been sympathy. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Through the small windows, she watched Georgetown University shrink below them, the familiar campus becoming a collection of toy buildings arranged around miniature lawns. Students still gathered in knots around the landing site, their phones glinting like scattered coins in the morning sun. She wondered what they were posting on social media, what hashtags would trend in the next hour. Hashtag Delta Force on campus? Hashtag mystery student? Hashtag what the hell just happened? The lead operator, who'd introduced himself only as Control, sat across from her with a tablet balanced on his knees. Even through his tactical gear, Sarah could sense the coiled energy of someone accustomed to making decisions that carried life and death consequences. When he spoke, it was with the measured cadence of someone who'd learned that words, like bullets, should be fired only when necessary and with precise targeting. "Phoenix," he said, using the call sign like it was her actual name. "We need to brief you on the operational parameters." "My name is Sarah," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Sarah Chen, not Phoenix." Control studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable behind ballistic glasses that reflected her own face back at her. "Names are tools," he said finally. "Sarah Chen is a graduate student with a promising academic future. Phoenix is someone who can save millions of lives in the next 17 hours. Which one do you want to be today?" The question hit harder than she'd expected. Sarah had spent her entire life being Sarah Chen, the daughter of 2 professors, the student who'd skipped grades and collected academic awards, the young woman who planned her future in careful, methodical steps. Phoenix was something else entirely, a digital warrior, a code breaker, someone who'd accidentally demonstrated capabilities that attracted the attention of military operators who dropped from helicopters like angels of war. "I don't know how to be Phoenix," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines. "You've been Phoenix for 2 weeks, Control replied. "You just didn't know it yet." The operator to her right, Nakamura, according to his gear, leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, if I may, sometimes we discover who we really are when circumstances demand it. I was just a kid from Oakland who liked video games until my unit got pinned down in Afghanistan, and I had to become someone who could call in precision airstrikes while under fire." His voice carried weight that spoke of experiences Sarah couldn't imagine. "You'll find your way." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to center herself, drawing on meditation techniques her mother had taught her during the stressful final months of high school. Dr. Lisa Wang Chun had always said that panic was just energy looking for direction, and that the key to managing overwhelming situations was to channel that energy productively rather than letting it scatter in all directions. She opened her eyes. Control was watching her with something that might have been approval. "Better? Getting there." Sarah took a steadying breath. "What exactly am I walking into?" Control activated his tablet, and the screen filled with a 3-dimensional network diagram that rotated slowly in digital space. Sarah recognized it immediately as a representation of military communication systems, with nodes and connections mapped across what looked like multiple continents. Red indicators pulsed at various points, spreading like infection through the network's architecture. 48 hours ago, our monitoring systems detected unusual activity in classified networks, Control began. At first, it looked like routine probing. Foreign intelligence services test our defenses constantly, looking for weaknesses, but this was different. The intrusion signatures didn't match any known attack patterns. Sarah studied the diagram, her mind automatically analyzing the data flow patterns. "It's not a conventional attack," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "This is architectural. They're not trying to steal data or plant malware. They're rewriting the fundamental protocols." "Exactly." Control's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. Most cyber attacks are like burglary break-in. Take what you can carry, get out before anyone notices. This is more like renovation. They're systematically rebuilding our networks to serve their purposes. The implications made Sarah's stomach clench. She'd studied theoretical attacks of this type in graduate seminars, usually as thought experiments, that professors assured students would be impossible to execute in reality. The computational resources required, the coordination necessary across multiple attack vectors, the deep understanding of target systems that should have been beyond the capabilities of any single nation-state, let alone a rogue organization. Who's behind it? She asked. Control exchanged glances with Torres and Nakamura before answering. We're not entirely sure. The attack signatures suggest a hybrid operation state-level resources, but non-state-level operational freedom. Best guess is a partnership between foreign intelligence services and private contractors with extremely advanced capabilities. Mercenaries, Torres added grimly. Cyber mercenaries with military-grade resources and no rules of engagement. Sarah had read about such groups in cybersecurity journals, shadowy organizations that sold digital warfare capabilities to the highest bidder, operating in legal gray areas where traditional law enforcement couldn't touch them. They were the stuff of paranoid fiction and academic speculation. Apparently, they were also real enough to threaten the infrastructure that kept hundreds of millions of people safe. The helicopter banked sharply, and through the window, Sarah caught sight of their destination, a complex of low, unremarkable buildings surrounded by multiple layers of security fencing. From the air, it looked like any other government facility. But the precision of its layout and the obvious care taken to minimize its visual signature suggested something far more significant. Welcome to nowhere, Nakamura said with dark humor. Officially, this facility doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's where we bring problems that can't be solved through conventional channels. As they descended, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of pre-performance nerves she'd experienced before major programming competitions or thesis defenses. But this was different. The stakes weren't academic grades or professional recognition. This was about whether the lights would stay on, whether airplanes would land safely, whether the digital infrastructure that supported modern civilization would continue functioning. The landing was smooth, practiced, performed by a pilot who'd clearly done this hundreds of times before. As the rotors wound down, Control unbuckled his harness and turned to Sarah with an expression that managed to be both reassuring and intensely serious. Once we go through those doors, he said, gesturing toward a nondescript entrance flanked by guards in military fatigues, you're committed. This isn't academic anymore. The code you'll be working with is live. The systems you'll be accessing are currently under attack, and the decisions you make will have consequences that ripple across multiple continents. He paused, studying her face. Are you ready for that? Sarah thought about her parents, probably preparing for their Saturday morning routines, her father reading technical journals over coffee, her mother grading undergraduate calculus exams with meticulous care. They'd raised her to believe that knowledge carried responsibility, that gifts should be used in service of something larger than personal advancement. They'd never imagined their daughter would face a test of those principles at 23 years old, in circumstances that seemed borrowed from a thriller novel. I'm scared, she admitted, then straightened her shoulders. But I'm ready. Control nodded once, sharp and approving. Fear is good. It keeps you careful. Overconfidence kills more operators than enemy fire. He stood and moved toward the helicopters. Door, time to meet your team. The facility's interior was a study in controlled chaos. Corridors lined with windowless doors led deeper into the building's maze-like structure, while personnel in various uniforms moved with the purposeful efficiency of people fighting a war most of the world didn't know existed. Sarah caught glimpses of computer screens displaying network diagrams, situation rooms where officers spoke in urgent whispers, and equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. They paused at a checkpoint where a stern-faced woman in Navy uniform scanned Sarah's temporary credentials with professional skepticism. "First time in the sandbox, ma'am?" she asked, using what was apparently military slang for classified facilities. "First time anywhere like this," Sarah replied honestly. The security officer's expression softened slightly. "You'll do fine. Just remember, everything you see here is compartmentalized. Need to know only. Don't ask questions about things that aren't directly related to your mission." She handed back Sarah's credentials with a slight smile. "And don't touch anything that looks expensive. Most of our equipment costs more than a house." The briefing room was smaller than Sarah had expected, dominated by a conference table surrounded by chairs that had clearly seen heavy use. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time network status, global communication flows, and what looked like a countdown timer that currently read 14 hours 37 minutes and 22 seconds and was decreasing steadily. 14 hours 37 minutes and 22 seconds until whatever they were trying to prevent became unstoppable. 3 people were already seated at the table, and they turned as Sarah entered with an attention that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. Control gestured to each in turn. "Phoenix, meet your team. Colonel Jennifer Hayes, our liaison with Cyber Command. Dr. Michael Reeves, senior cryptanalyst with NSA. And Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, our systems specialist." Colonel Hayes was a compact woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. When she stood to shake Sarah's hand, her grip was firm without being challenging, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned respect rather than simply receiving it by virtue of rank. "Miss Chen," she said, "I've reviewed your academic record and the analysis of your competition performance. Impressive work, especially considering you solved problems our senior staff couldn't crack." Dr. Reeves was older, perhaps in his 60s, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time thinking about abstract problems than managing his physical appearance. His handshake was distracted, and Sarah noticed ink stains on his fingers. Apparently some intellectual habits transcended digital tools. "The quantum encryption variant you developed," he said without preamble. "Where did the inspiration come from?" "The mathematical foundation suggests familiarity with theoretical frameworks that aren't typically covered in graduate coursework." Sarah felt herself blushing. "I read a lot," she said. "Mathematics journals, physics papers, anything that seemed interesting. I like seeing how different fields connect to each other." "Autodidactic learning," Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly. "The best cryptanalysts are usually polymaths. Single-discipline expertise only takes you so far when you're dealing with adversaries who think outside conventional boundaries." Technical Sergeant Park appeared to be closer to Sarah's age, perhaps late 20s, with the sort of controlled energy that suggested extensive caffeine consumption and a comfort level with working under pressure. When she spoke, it was with the rapid-fire delivery of someone accustomed to conveying complex technical information quickly and accurately. "Ma'am, I've set up a workstation with access to the compromised networks," she said. "Full isolation protocols, so anything you do won't risk spreading contamination to our clean systems. You'll have real-time monitoring of the attack progression and access to our complete arsenal of analysis tools." Colonel Hayes gestured for everyone to take their seats, then activated a large display that showed the same network diagram Sarah had seen in the helicopter, but with far more detail. The red indicators representing compromised systems had spread significantly, even in the time it had taken them to fly here and complete introductions. "Current situation," the colonel began. "The attack has successfully penetrated primary defense networks in 14 allied nations. Secondary systems are showing early intrusion signatures. At current progression rates, Complete compromise will occur in approximately 14 hours and 28 minutes. The countdown timer on the wall seemed to pulse with ominous emphasis. What happens at 0? Sarah asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Best case scenario, Dr. Reeves replied grimly. Coordinated disruption of civil and military communications. Air traffic control goes down, power grids destabilize, emergency services lose coordination capability. Millions of people affected. Economic damage in the tens of billions, but civilization continues functioning. Worst case? Sarah prompted. Colonel Hayes answered this time. Complete systems compromise allows the attackers to actively control rather than simply disrupt our infrastructure. They could trigger cascading failures in power grids, cause transportation disasters, disable nuclear safety systems. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, potentially millions depending on how sophisticated their coordination is. Sarah stared at the network diagram, watching red indicators pulse like infection spreading through a body. Each node represented thousands or millions of people who had no idea their safety depended on decisions made by strangers in windowless rooms. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but also strangely energizing. Her entire academic career had been preparation for challenges exactly like this, even if she'd never imagined the context would be quite so dramatic. "Show me the code," she said. The workstation Technical Sergeant Park had prepared looked like mission control for a digital war. 3 curved monitors displayed cascading data streams, network topologies, and code segments that scrolled past faster than normal human eyes could follow. But Sarah's eyes weren't normal. She'd spent years training herself to parse complex information at high speed, to see patterns in chaos that others missed entirely. She settled into the ergonomic chair and cracked her knuckles, a habit that always annoyed her roommate Elena, but helped her focus when approaching difficult problems. The familiar ritual grounded her, connected her to thousands of hours spent debugging code, solving puzzles, and pushing the boundaries of what she thought was possible. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, forgetting where she was as the attack code revealed itself in all its malevolent beauty. "Language Phoenix," Control said mildly from his position behind her shoulder, but there was understanding in his voice rather than criticism. "No, you don't understand," Sarah said, her fingers already flying across the keyboard as she began dissecting the code architecture. "This isn't just sophisticated. It's art, malicious, devastating art. But the underlying mathematics are absolutely gorgeous." Dr. Reeves leaned forward with interest. "What do you see that we missed?" Sarah paused her typing and gestured. At the center monitor, where she'd isolated a particular segment of the attack code, "Look at this recursive function." At first glance, it appears to be a standard encryption algorithm, something you might find in any corporate security system. But watch what happens when I trace the execution path. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, highlighting different sections of code in various colors. Gradually, a pattern emerged that was far more complex than the individual components suggested. Like a fractal, the code revealed deeper layers of organization the more closely it was examined. "It's not actually recursive," she continued, excitement building in her voice despite the dire circumstances. "It's using recursive patterns to mask parallel processing. Each apparent function call is actually triggering simultaneous operations across multiple attack vectors. That's why conventional defenses haven't been effective. We've been trying to stop a single complex attack, when it's actually thousands of simple attacks coordinated with quantum-level precision." Colonel Hayes moved closer to the workstation. "Can you stop it?" "Not directly," Sarah admitted. "But I think I can turn its own complexity against it. The same mathematical principles that make it so effective also create potential instabilities. If I can identify the right pressure points." She trailed off, already lost in the problem. For the next 2 hours, Sarah worked with an intensity that surprised even her. She'd always been focused when programming, capable of losing herself in code for hours at a time, but this was different. This was combat, fought with algorithms instead of bullets, where every line of code could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. The attack pattern began to reveal its secrets slowly, like a complex lock yielding to a master safecracker. Sarah identified 7 primary intrusion vectors, each disguised as routine network maintenance traffic. She mapped the communication protocols that allowed compromised systems to coordinate their activities. Most importantly, she began to understand the attack's temporal architecture. It wasn't designed to cause immediate damage, but to establish persistent, nearly undetectable control over target systems. "It's a sleeper network," she announced suddenly, startling the others who'd been watching her work in respectful silence. "The attack isn't designed to destroy our systems immediately. It's building infrastructure for long-term control. Once it reaches full deployment, the attackers will have persistent backdoor access to every compromised system." Technical Sergeant Park whistled softly. "That's actually worse than immediate destruction. They could spy on classified communications indefinitely, subtly manipulate data, gradually degrade system reliability in ways that would be almost impossible to detect." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And because the infiltration is happening gradually, using protocols that mimic legitimate traffic, our automated defense systems are treating it as routine maintenance rather than an active attack." Dr. Reeves had been taking notes on a tablet, his stylus moving with the quick, precise strokes of someone accustomed to capturing complex ideas quickly. "The mathematical sophistication suggests state-level resources," he said. "This isn't the work of basement hackers or even criminal organizations. Someone with access to supercomputing resources and advanced cryptographic research developed this attack." "But who?" Colonel Hayes asked. "Our intelligence suggests this is a hybrid operation, too creative for conventional military units, but too well-resourced for independent actors." Sarah paused in her coding and turned to face the group. "I might have an idea about that," she said reluctantly. "The code architecture uses some very specific mathematical approaches. Quantum classical hybrid algorithms, specifically variants, that were proposed in a series of research papers published about 18 months ago." "Papers you've read?" Control asked. "Papers I've memorized," Sarah corrected. The lead author was Dr. Alexei Volkov, formerly with Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. He was working on quantum cryptography applications until he disappeared from academic circles about 6 months ago. The room fell silent except for the soft humming of computer fans and the distant sound of military personnel moving through the corridors outside. Sarah could see the implications registering on everyone's faces. A brilliant Russian cryptographer with state-level training and resources, now apparently working for unknown masters with hostile intent toward Western infrastructure. "We need to contact Cyber Command," Colonel Hayes said, reaching for a secure telephone. "If Volkov is involved, this changes our threat assessment significantly." As the colonel made her calls, Sarah returned to the code, but her concentration had been broken. She found herself thinking about Dr. Volkov, trying to imagine the circumstances that might drive a respected academic to design weapons capable of crippling the digital infrastructure of entire continents. Money, ideology, coercion? The motivation mattered less than the capability. But understanding the human element might provide insights into weaknesses in the attack architecture. "Phoenix," Control said quietly, "how are you holding up?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She was exhausted, running on adrenaline and caffeine, working on problems that were far beyond anything she'd encountered in academic settings. But she was also more engaged than she'd ever been in her life. Every challenge the attack code presented demanded the full range of her capabilities: mathematical intuition, programming skill, pattern recognition, creative problem solving. It was like playing a video game where the final boss was reality itself. "I'm scared," she said honestly. "But I don't know how to describe it. This is what I've been training for my entire life without knowing it. Every math competition, every programming contest, every late night spent debugging impossible problem. It was all preparation for this moment." "That's good," Control said. "Fear and excitement aren't opposites. They're different faces of the same energy. The trick is channeling that energy productively." Before Sarah could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and the countdown timer on the wall suddenly jumped from 12 hours 15 minutes and 33 seconds to 8 hours 45 minutes and 17 seconds. 8 hours and 45 minutes. What the hell? Technical Sergeant Park was frantically typing at her own workstation, pulling up system status displays that showed cascading failures across multiple networks. "Colonel," Hayes ended her phone call abruptly and moved to the main display. "Report." "The attack just accelerated," Dr. Reeves said grimly, his face pale as he studied incoming data streams. "It appears our analysis activities triggered some kind of defensive response. The attack code has shifted to active mode." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. She'd been so focused on understanding the attack that she hadn't considered the possibility that the code might be monitoring for analysis attempts. Her probing had been detected, and now the attackers knew their operation was under investigation. "How much time do we have?" she asked, though she could see the answer on the countdown display. "Less than 9 hours, Colonel Hayes replied tersely. "The attack timeline has compressed significantly. Instead of gradual infiltration followed by coordinated activation, we're now looking at aggressive penetration and immediate deployment." Sarah turned back to her workstation with renewed urgency. The code was still there, still revealing its secrets, but now it felt like handling a live bomb that might detonate at any moment. Every keystroke carried risk. Further analysis might yield crucial insights, but it might also trigger additional defensive responses that would accelerate the attack even more. "I need to work faster," she said, more to herself than to the others. "We all do," Control replied. "But don't sacrifice accuracy for speed. One mistake now could make the situation worse." As Sarah dove back into the code, she became aware of increased activity throughout the facility. Personnel moved through corridors with greater urgency. Conversations were conducted in hushed, urgent tones, and she could hear the sound of additional helicopters landing outside. Reinforcements were arriving, but she wasn't sure what conventional military resources could contribute to a battle fought entirely in digital space. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of code analysis, failed countermeasure attempts, and growing desperation. Sarah identified 17 different vulnerabilities in the attack architecture, but each time she tried to exploit them, the code adapted, closing gaps and rerouting through alternative pathways. It was like fighting an opponent who could see her moves before she made them. "It's learning," she announced during what felt like her 100th failed attempt to disrupt the attack sequence. "The code isn't just following pre-programmed instructions. It's using machine learning algorithms to adapt to our countermeasures in real time." "Artificial intelligence?" Dr. Reeves asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Not artificial intelligence exactly," Sarah clarified. "More like artificial intuition. The attack code is using pattern recognition to predict our responses and preemptively adapt its approach. Every time we try to stop it, it gets better at defending itself." Technical Sergeant Park looked up from her own workstation with the expression of dawning horror. "Ma'am, if the attack code is learning from our countermeasures, then every failed attempt is making it stronger. We're not just racing against time, we're racing against our own efforts to stop it." The implications were staggering. Traditional cybersecurity assumed that understanding an attack was the first step toward defeating it. But this attack was designed to turn analysis against itself, using every probing attempt as training data for improved defenses. The more they learned about it, the more it learned about them. Sarah stared at the code on her monitors, feeling like David facing Goliath, but a Goliath who grew larger and smarter every time a stone was thrown at him. "Phoenix," Control said quietly, "we need options. What you've discovered about the attack's adaptive capabilities, is there any way to use that against it?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. The facility around them had taken on the atmosphere of a war room, with personnel moving between stations, updating situation boards, and speaking in the clipped, urgent tones of people managing a crisis that was spiraling beyond conventional solutions. "Maybe," she said slowly, "the machine learning algorithms that make it adaptive also make it vulnerable to specific types of manipulation. If I can't stop it directly, maybe I can confuse it. Feed it contradictory data, force it to learn patterns that aren't actually there." "Explain," Colonel Hayes commanded, moving closer to Sarah's workstation. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up diagnostic displays that showed the attack's learning patterns. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of data flows that pulsed across the screen like digital heartbeats. "The attack code is constantly sampling our defensive responses and updating its algorithms accordingly. But machine learning systems have a weakness. They can be poisoned with bad training data." Dr. Reeves nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "You want to feed it false information about our capabilities." "More than that," Sarah said, excitement building in her voice. "I want to teach it to be afraid of shadows. If I can create fake defensive signatures that suggest capabilities we don't actually have, the attack code will waste computational resources defending against threats that don't exist." Technical Sergeant Park was already pulling up system specifications on her workstation. "What kind of resources would you need to implement something like that?" "Time mostly," Sarah replied, "and access to some of our own adaptive systems. I need to create counterfeit network traffic that looks real enough to fool machine learning algorithms, but fake enough to send them down the wrong analytical paths." The next hour was a masterclass in improvisational cybersecurity. Sarah worked with Technical Sergeant Park to design fake network signatures that mimicked advanced defensive systems, quantum encryption modules that didn't exist, AI-powered countermeasure algorithms that were pure fiction, distributed computing, networks that were nothing more than clever simulations. As they implemented each fake signature, they watched the attack code respond, its algorithms evolving to counter threats that weren't real. Computational resources that should have been used for legitimate infiltration were instead devoted to defending against imaginary capabilities. "It's working," Dr. Reeves said, with something approaching wonder in his voice. "The attack's progression rate is slowing. Not by much, but measurably." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by realism. "This is just buying us time," she warned. "The attack code will eventually figure out that our defensive signatures are fake. Machine learning systems are good at detecting inconsistencies, and I can't maintain these illusions indefinitely." "How much time?" Colonel Hayes asked. Sarah studied the progression charts on her monitors, calculating the rate at which the attack was adapting to her deceptions. "Maybe 3 hours before it sees through the major fake signatures. Less if whoever's controlling it realizes what we're doing and intervenes manually. Then we need to use those 3 hours to find a permanent solution," Control said grimly. As if summoned by his words, a new alarm began sounding throughout the facility. This one was different from the previous alerts, sharper, more urgent, demanding immediate attention. Technical Sergeant Park's workstation erupted in warning messages, and the countdown timer on the wall flickered ominously. "We've got a problem," she announced, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The attack just opened a new vector. It's no longer just targeting military and infrastructure networks. Civilian systems are being compromised: banking networks, medical databases, social media platforms, e-commerce sites. Sarah's blood ran cold as the implications hit her. Military and infrastructure attacks were devastating, but they were also somewhat contained. Civilian systems compromise meant that ordinary people, students like her, families like hers, individuals who'd never signed up for digital warfare, were about to become casualties. How widespread? Colonel Hayes demanded. Global, Dr. Reeves replied, his face pale as he studied incoming reports. Every major financial institution in North America and Europe is showing intrusion signatures. Hospital networks are reporting system anomalies. Even universities are being targeted. Sarah thought about Georgetown, about her classmates and professors, going about their Saturday routines, completely unaware that their personal information, academic records, and financial data were being systematically compromised. She thought about her parents in California, probably grading papers or preparing lectures, having no idea that their daughter was sitting in a classified facility, trying to prevent digital catastrophe. Why the escalation? She asked, though. She suspected she already knew the answer. Because we hurt them, Control said grimly. Your deception strategies damaged their operational timeline. Now they're accelerating everything, hitting as many targets as possible before we can mount an effective defense. The weight of unintended consequences settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. Her clever countermeasures had worked exactly as intended, but success had triggered a response that made the overall situation worse. Instead of a focused attack on military targets, they were now facing an all-out assault on the digital infrastructure that supported billions of lives. I made it worse, she whispered, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. No, Dr. Reeves said firmly. You bought us time and forced them to reveal their full capabilities. That's valuable intelligence, even if it came at a cost. Intelligence doesn't help the people whose bank accounts are being drained or whose medical records are being stolen. Sarah replied bitterly. Technical Sergeant Park looked up from her workstation with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal sympathy. Ma'am, with respect, we can't save everyone. But if we can stop the core attack, we can minimize the overall damage. Sometimes you have to choose between bad and worse. Sarah knew she was right, but the knowledge didn't make the decision any easier. She'd spent her entire academic career studying theoretical problems with theoretical solutions. Real-world problems came with real-world casualties, and the weight of responsibility was crushing. Show me the civilian attack vectors, she said, forcing herself to focus on the problem rather than its implications. The data that appeared on her monitors was even more sophisticated than the military attack code. Where the infrastructure assault had been focused and surgical, the civilian attacks were broad and opportunistic. The same core algorithms were being adapted to exploit vulnerabilities across thousands of different systems, each customized for its specific target. It's like watching a virus mutate in real time, she observed, studying the attack patterns. The core functionality remains consistent, but the implementation details change for each target system. Can you stop it the same way you slowed the military attack? Colonel Hayes asked. Sarah considered the question carefully, analyzing the code structure and looking for similar vulnerabilities. Maybe, she said finally. But it would require a different approach. The civilian systems don't have the same defensive architecture as military networks. I can't fake capabilities that don't exist if the underlying systems don't support any capabilities at all. Then what do you suggest? Control asked. Sarah stared at the scrolling code, her mind racing through possibilities. An idea began to form, dangerous, unprecedented, but potentially effective if executed correctly. It would require her to do something that violated every principle of responsible cybersecurity she'd ever learned. I think I need to become the virus, she said quietly. The room fell silent except for the constant hum of computer equipment and the distant sound of military personnel managing the crisis. Everyone was staring at Sarah with expressions that ranged from confusion to alarm. "Explain," Dr. Reeves said carefully. Sarah turned to face the group, her expression serious but determined. "The attack code is effective because it adapts to each target system individually. But that adaptation requires communication between the core attack algorithms and the individual deployment modules. If I can insert myself into that communication channel, if I can mimic the attack code's own protocols, I might be able to feed false instructions to the deployment modules." "You want to impersonate the attack?" Technical Sergeant Park asked, her voice rising with disbelief. "More than impersonate," Sarah clarified. "I want to become part of it. Insert my own code into the attack architecture, disguised as legitimate attack modules. Once I'm inside the system, I can start feeding contradictory instructions, causing the individual attacks to interfere with each other." Colonel Hayes was shaking her head before Sarah finished speaking. "The risk is enormous. If your infiltration is detected, you could trigger an even more aggressive response. And if your code is captured and analyzed, it could give the attackers insights into our defensive capabilities." "The risk of doing nothing is worse," Sarah replied. "In 6 hours, this attack will have compromised every major civilian system in the Western world. Banking will collapse, medical systems will fail, communication networks will be unreliable. We're looking at the potential breakdown of digital civilization." Control studied Sarah's expression with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent years making decisions under impossible circumstances. "What do you need?" "Complete access to our most advanced systems," Sarah said. "I need to write code that's sophisticated enough to fool machine learning algorithms designed by someone who might be smarter than I am. And I need to do it in less than 6 hours while the target systems are actively evolving." "And if you fail?" Dr. Reeves asked quietly. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "If I fail, we're no worse off than we are now. But if I succeed, we might actually win this thing." The decision was made with the kind of rapid consensus that only emerged in crisis situations. Within minutes, Sarah found herself with access to classified systems that she'd never imagined existed, working with computational resources that dwarfed anything she'd encountered in academic settings. The next 4 hours existed in a state of suspended reality for Sarah. She coded with an intensity that pushed her beyond normal human limitations, her fingers moving across the keyboard in patterns that seemed choreographed by some higher intelligence. Around her, the facility hummed with the barely controlled chaos of people fighting a war that most of the world didn't know was happening. Her infiltration code began as a digital chameleon, a program designed to mimic the attack's own communication protocols while secretly subverting its objectives. But as she worked, something unexpected began to happen. The deeper she penetrated into the attack architecture, the more she began to understand not just how it worked, but why it had been designed the way it was. "There's something wrong with this picture," she announced suddenly, startling Dr. Reeves, who'd been dozing in his chair after 36 hours of continuous work. "What do you mean?" Colonel Hayes asked, moving to peer over Sarah's shoulder at the code that filled her monitors. Sarah highlighted several sections of the attack algorithm, her expression troubled. "Look at these subroutines," she said. "They're designed to minimize collateral damage. When the attack compromises a medical system, it specifically avoids patient monitoring equipment. When it infiltrates banking networks, it leaves emergency fund access protocols intact." Technical Sergeant Park frowned at the implications. "Why would an attacker care about minimizing harm to civilians?" "Exactly my question," Sarah replied. "This isn't the work of terrorists or criminal organizations. They wouldn't care about collateral damage. In fact, they'd probably want to maximize it for psychological impact. This is someone who wants to demonstrate capability without causing unnecessary suffering. Dr. Reeves was fully awake now, studying the code segments Sarah had identified. It could be a demonstration, he said slowly. A proof of concept rather than an actual attack. Show what they're capable of, then use that capability as leverage in negotiations. Negotiations for what? Control asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer. Before anyone could respond, Sarah's infiltration program triggered an unexpected response. Instead of the defensive countermeasures she'd expected, her code was met with what could only be described as curiosity. The attack algorithms began probing her program, not to destroy it, but to understand it. "It's trying to talk to me," Sarah said with wonder in her voice. "That's impossible," Colonel Hayes replied. "It's just code." "It can't." Her words were cut off as text began appearing on Sarah's central monitor. Not error messages or diagnostic output, but actual words in English, appearing letter by letter as if someone was typing them in real time. Impressive work. "Phoenix, I was beginning to wonder when you would arrive." The room fell silent except for the sound of everyone's breathing. "Becoming more rapid." Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing through possibilities, none of which seemed adequate to explain what she was witnessing. "Who are you?" She typed in response, her fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. "I think you already know. The question is whether you're ready to hear the truth." Sarah's throat felt dry as desert sand. She thought about Dr. Alexei Volkov, the Russian cryptographer who disappeared from academic circles 6 months ago. She thought about the mathematical elegance of the attack code, the careful attention to minimizing civilian casualties. Way the algorithms seemed to anticipate her analytical approaches. "Volkov?" She typed. "Not quite, but close enough for our purposes. Sarah Chen, graduate student at Georgetown University, daughter of James Chen and Lisa Wan Chen, born in San Francisco on April 15, 2002. Your academic record is impressive, but your performance in the last 72 hours has been extraordinary." The personal details hit Sarah like physical blows. This wasn't just someone who'd researched her academic background. This was someone who had access to classified government databases, someone who'd been monitoring her family, someone who knew details about her life that should have been impossible to obtain. "What do you want?" SHE type. "What I've always wanted. To find someone capable of understanding the work, the real work, not the simplified demonstrations you've been analyzing." "Demonstrations?" Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard as implications began cascading through her mind. "The attack you've been fighting isn't real. Phoenix, IT's a test, an elaborate audition designed to identify individuals with the specific combination of technical skills, creative thinking, and moral flexibility needed for the next phase of the project." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. Everything she'd experienced in the last 3 days, the helicopter landing on campus, the frantic race against time, the desperate attempts to save civilization from digital collapse, had been an elaborate fiction designed to evaluate her capabilities. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "You're lying," she typed, but even as the words appeared on screen, she was beginning to see evidence that supported the claim. The attack's unusual concern for civilian safety, the way it had responded to her countermeasures with curiosity rather than hostility, the mathematical elegance that seemed designed to appeal to someone with her specific analytical preferences. Examine the code more carefully. "Phoenix, look for the signatures you missed when you were focused on defense rather than understanding." Against her better judgment, Sarah began analyzing the attack code with fresh eyes, looking for evidence that would confirm or refute the claim that everything had been a test. What she found made her stomach clench with a mixture of horror and admiration. Hidden deep in the algorithm's architecture were safeguards kill switches that would have prevented any actual damage to critical systems. The attack had been designed to appear devastating while remaining completely reversible. Every compromised system could be restored to its original state with a single command sequence. "It really is fake," she whispered, loud enough for the others to hear. Colonel Hayes leaned forward urgently. "What do you mean, fake?" Sarah gestured helplessly at her monitors. "The entire attack. It's an elaborate simulation. All the systems that appear to be compromised can be restored instantly. No real damage has been done to anything." "That's impossible," Dr. Reeves protested. "We've been monitoring actual network intrusions, real system compromises, real intrusions into test systems," Sarah corrected. "Look at the network addresses, the system identifiers. They're all variants of known testing environments. Sophisticated variants, but test systems nonetheless." The implications were staggering. The military crisis that had dominated the last 3 days, the frantic efforts to prevent digital catastrophe, the weight of responsibility for millions of lives, all of it had been theater, designed to create authentic pressure while evaluating Sarah's performance. "Congratulations, Phoenix, you've passed the first phase of evaluation. Now we can discuss the real work." "What real work?" Sarah typed, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to hear the answer. "The development of quantum cryptographic systems that will determine the balance of global power for the next century. Systems that will either protect human civilization from digital warfare or enable its complete destruction." Sarah stared at the message, feeling like Alice tumbling down a rabbit hole that led not to Wonderland, but to something far more dangerous. The person communicating with her, Volkov or someone working with him, was describing capabilities that went far beyond anything she'd encountered in academic literature. "Why me?" she typed. "Because you're one of perhaps 12 people on Earth with the cognitive architecture necessary to understand the mathematics involved. And because your moral framework makes you unlikely to use such capabilities for personal gain or destructive purposes." Around Sarah, the facility's personnel were watching the conversation with expressions that ranged from fascination to alarm. She could see Control speaking urgently into a communication device, probably briefing superiors who were struggling to process the revelation that their crisis had been manufactured. "What happens now?" Sarah typed. "Now you choose. Continue your academic career, pursue a conventional path in cybersecurity, and spend your life working on problems that represent perhaps 10% of your actual capabilities, or join an organization dedicated to ensuring that quantum cryptographic weapons are developed by people who understand their implications rather than by those who see them only as tools for domination." Sarah felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders again. But this time it was different. 3 days ago, she'd been asked to help defend civilization from attack. Now she was being asked to help shape the weapons that would determine civilization's future. "What organization?" she typed. "We don't have a name. Official designations would only create targets for intelligence agencies and criminal organizations. We're researchers, mathematicians, cryptographers, and computer scientists from multiple countries, united by the understanding that quantum computing will either save or destroy human civilization." The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Hayes, who placed a firm hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Miss Chen, I need you to step away from the keyboard. We're dealing with a potential intelligence operation, and continued communication could compromise national security." Sarah looked up at the colonel's face, seeing genuine concern mixed with professional authority. Around the room, she could see similar expressions on everyone else. People who'd spent 3 days working alongside her, fighting what they'd believed was a genuine crisis, now grappling with the revelation that they'd been participants in an elaborate test. "Phoenix," the colonel continued, "this conversation needs to be handled by specialists in counterintelligence. You've done extraordinary work, but this situation is beyond your training or security clearance. Sarah understood the logic, but she also understood that this might be her only opportunity to communicate with whoever had orchestrated the test. Once counterintelligence specialists took over, the conversation would become adversarial rather than exploratory. "Give me 5 more minutes," she said. "Please. I need to understand what's really happening here." Colonel Hayes hesitated, clearly weighing operational security against the value of continued intelligence gathering. Finally, she nodded. 5 minutes. But I want everything documented, and if the conversation takes any turn that suggests immediate threat, we terminate it immediately. Sarah turned back to her keyboard, acutely aware that her next few exchanges might determine not just her own future, but potentially the direction of global cybersecurity development. "How do I know this isn't just another test?" She typed, "Because the next phase involves real consequences. The demonstration you've been experiencing was designed to evaluate your capabilities without risk. What comes next will involve actual classified systems, actual vulnerabilities, and actual opportunities to either strengthen or compromise global security. And if I refuse, you return to your academic career. Your security clearance is revoked, your knowledge of this incident is classified, and you spend the rest of your life knowing that you had the opportunity to help shape the future of human civilization, but chose safety instead." Sarah felt the truth of those words like a physical weight. She'd spent the last 3 days discovering capabilities she'd never imagined she possessed, working on problems that demanded every aspect of her intelligence and creativity. The thought of returning to graduate seminars and thesis defenses felt like voluntarily accepting imprisonment. But she also thought about her parents, about Elena and her other friends, about the normal life she'd built for herself through years of careful planning and hard work. Joining this mysterious organization would mean abandoning everything familiar, stepping into a world where the stakes were always existential and the choices were never simple. "I need time to think," she typed. "Time is the one resource we can't provide unlimited quantities of. Quantum computing capabilities are advancing rapidly, and the window for developing effective safeguards is narrowing. Every month we delay is a month closer to a world where digital weapons can destroy civilization overnight. How long do I have to decide? 72 hours. After that, the opportunity expires and we move to other candidates." Before Sarah could respond, the communication terminated. Her monitors returned to displaying normal system diagnostics, leaving no trace that the conversation had ever occurred, except for the profound sense of displacement that settled over everyone in the room. The 72 hours that followed were the longest of Sarah's life. She was debriefed by counterintelligence specialists who asked the same questions in dozens of different ways, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal whether she'd been compromised or recruited. She was interviewed by senior Defense Department officials who wanted to understand the implications of the test she'd experienced. She was examined by psychologists who assessed her mental state and decision-making capacity. Through it all, she felt like she was living in a strange limbo between her old life and something she couldn't quite name. Officially, she was on temporary leave from Georgetown University for family reasons. Her professors had been told she was dealing with a medical emergency. Her classmates had been informed she'd taken a research position with a defense contractor, and her parents had been briefed by people who spoke in careful euphemisms about national service opportunities. The facility where she'd spent 3 days fighting a fictional crisis had been transformed back into its normal operational mode, whatever that was. The urgency and desperation that had defined those hours had been replaced by routine military efficiency. Personnel moved through corridors with the measured pace of people managing ongoing operations rather than immediate emergencies. On the second day of her deliberation period, Sarah was surprised to receive a visit from someone she hadn't expected to see again. Control, whose real name, she learned, was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, found her in the small quarters she'd been assigned while security officials decided what to do with her. "Knock, knock," he said, tapping gently on the open doorframe. "Mind if I come in?" Sarah gestured to the room's single chair while she remained sitting on the narrow bed. "I didn't think I'd see you again after the debriefing." "Officially, you're not," Webb replied with a slight smile. "This conversation isn't happening, and if anyone asks, I was never here." He settled into the chair with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. "How are you holding up?" "I honestly don't know," Sarah answered. 3 days ago, I was a graduate student worried about thesis deadlines and student loans. Now I'm apparently someone whose decisions might affect global security. It's a little overwhelming," Webb nodded with understanding. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I still sometimes feel like I'm pretending to be someone more important than I actually am. The difference is that eventually you realize everyone else is pretending too. We're all just people trying to make the best decisions we can with incomplete information." Sarah found that oddly comforting. "Is that why you're here? To give me career counseling?" "Partly," Webb admitted. "But also because I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, you've already made a difference. The work you did during the test, even though the crisis wasn't real, your responses were. The countermeasures you developed, the analytical approaches you use, the way you thought about problems that conventional wisdom said were unsolvable, all of that is real. And all of it is valuable. Valuable enough to justify what was essentially a 3-day kidnapping." Sarah asked with more bitterness than she'd intended. Webb's expression became more serious. "The test wasn't authorized by anyone in the official chain of command." He sighed carefully. "When we traced the operation afterward, we found evidence of coordination between multiple intelligence agencies, academic institutions, and private contractors. Someone with access to classified systems and significant resources orchestrated an elaborate fiction designed to evaluate you specifically." The implications made Sarah's stomach clench. "So whoever contacted me really is operating outside normal government channels." "That's our assessment," Webb confirmed. "Which makes your decision even more significant. If you choose to join them, you'll be operating in spaces where normal oversight and accountability don't exist. If you choose not to, you might be the only person who can provide intelligence about their capabilities and intentions." Sarah stared out the room's small window at the unremarkable landscape surrounding the facility. Somewhere out there, her normal life was waiting for her classmates taking midterm exams, professors updating syllabi, Alina probably wondering why her roommate had disappeared without explanation. It felt both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close. "What would you do?" she asked. Webb was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "When I was your age, I thought the most important thing was making choices that would lead to success and security. I wanted a predictable career, a comfortable life, recognition for my achievements." He paused, studying his hands. "It took me years to realize that the most important choices aren't about what you want to become, but about what you're willing to sacrifice to protect the things you care about." "That's not really an answer," Sarah pointed out. "No," Webb agreed, "because it's not really a question I can answer for you. But I will say this based on what I observed during the test. You have capabilities that could genuinely change the world. The question is whether you trust yourself to use those capabilities responsibly." After Webb left, Sarah spent hours walking the facility's corridors, thinking about responsibility and sacrifice, about the difference between safety and cowardice, about the weight of unused potential. She thought about Dr. Volkov, wherever he was, and the mysterious organization that had demonstrated the ability to orchestrate elaborate fictions involving multiple government agencies. She thought about quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and the digital weapons that would shape the next century of human conflict. Most of all, She thought about the moment when she'd first seen the attack code and recognized it as beautiful. That moment of aesthetic appreciation for mathematical elegance, even in the service of destruction, had revealed something about herself that she was still trying to understand. On the final day of her deliberation period, Sarah was granted permission to make a secure video call to her parents. Seeing their faces on the screen, her father's concerned expression, her mother's barely controlled worry brought home the reality of what her choice would mean for the people who loved her. "We can't discuss the details," Dr. Chen said carefully, clearly having been briefed about what he could and couldn't say. "But we want you to know that whatever you decide, we're proud of you and will support your choice, even if it means we might not see you very often." Dr. Wang Chun added, her voice catching slightly on the words. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the crisis had begun. "I don't know what I'm going to choose yet," she admitted. "But I know that whatever I decide, it won't be because I don't love you or don't want to be part of the family. It'll be because I think it's the right thing to do." Her parents exchanged a look that spoke of decades of marriage and shared understanding. "That's all we've ever wanted," her mother said. "For you to have the courage to do what you think is right, even when it's difficult." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her small room and made her decision. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Colonel Hayes and the senior officials who were managing her case. When they assembled in the same briefing room where she'd first learned about the test, Sarah felt like she was completing a circle that had begun with her frozen moment on Georgetown's campus. "I've made my decision," she announced without preamble. "I'm going to join them." The room erupted in questions and objections, but Sarah held up a hand for silence. "I'm not finished. I'm going to join them, but not on their terms. I'm going to be a double agent." Colonel Hayes leaned forward with sharp attention. "Explain. Whoever orchestrated this test has capabilities that represent a potential threat to national security," Sarah said. "But they also have capabilities that could be used to strengthen our defenses against genuine attacks. I want to work with them to develop quantum cryptographic systems, but I want to do it in a way that serves American interests rather than some unknown agenda." "That's incredibly dangerous," Dr. Reeves pointed out. "If they discover that you're reporting to us, the consequences could be severe." "Everything about this situation is dangerous," Sarah replied. "But I think the risk of doing nothing is worse than the risk of infiltrating their organization. And I think I'm uniquely positioned to succeed, because they expect me to be naive and idealistic." The discussion that followed was intense, involving secure communications with officials at levels of government Sarah hadn't known existed. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of Sarah's proposed course of action. Intelligence specialists assessed the operational risks and potential benefits. Psychologists evaluated her emotional and mental fitness for deep cover work. In the end, the decision was made at levels far above Sarah's pay grade, but the result was communicated to her with startling directness. Her proposal was approved. She would be trained as an intelligence operative, provided with resources and support systems, and then allowed to make contact with the mysterious organization that had tested her. The training that followed was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. She learned about operational security, covert communication, psychological manipulation, and the dozens of skills that intelligence operatives use to survive and succeed in hostile environments. She studied the psychology of recruitment, the techniques that criminal and terrorist organizations use to identify and cultivate assets. Most importantly, she learned to think like someone who was genuinely considering betraying her country for idealistic reasons. The cover story she would present was that she'd become disillusioned with government oversight and wanted to work with people who shared her vision of using technology to create a more secure world. 6 weeks after her initial recruitment test, Sarah received the contact instructions she'd been waiting for. They came in the form of a seemingly innocent email about a computer science conference in Prague. But embedded in the metadata was a complex cryptographic puzzle. That took her 3 days to solve. The solution led to coordinates for a meeting. In a small cafe in Georgetown, less than 2 miles from the university campus where her life had changed forever. The irony wasn't lost on her. She would begin her career as a covert operative in the same neighborhood where she'd been a naive graduate student just weeks earlier. The cafe in Georgetown, where Sarah met her contact, looked exactly like the kind of place where graduate students came to study and academics came to debate theoretical problems over expensive coffee. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the name was probably fake, but the credentials were impressive, looked like a professor of mathematics, which according to Sarah's intelligence briefings, she actually was, or had been, before disappearing from her position at MIT 8 months earlier. "Phoenix," Dr. Vasquez said warmly, as if greeting an old friend rather than initiating contact with a potential recruit. "I'm so pleased you decided to join us." Sarah had rehearsed this moment dozens of times during her training, but the reality was still surreal. She was sitting across from someone who was technically an enemy of the state, someone whose organization had demonstrated the ability to manipulate government agencies and military resources for their own purposes. Yet the woman across from her seemed genuinely committed to using advanced technology for humanitarian purposes. "I still have questions," Sarah said, staying in character as an idealistic graduate student who'd become disillusioned with government oversight. "About what you're really trying to accomplish, about whether I can trust you, about what I'm getting myself into." Dr. Vasquez smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Questions are good. Trust should be earned, not assumed. And what you're getting yourself into is the most important work of the next century, ensuring that the transition to quantum computing strengthens human civilization rather than destroying it. Valuable enough to justify what was essentially a 3-day kidnapping." Sarah asked with more bitterness than she'd intended. Webb's expression became more serious. "The test wasn't authorized by anyone in the official chain of command," he sighed carefully. "When we traced the operation afterward, we found evidence of coordination between multiple intelligence agencies, academic institutions, and private contractors. Someone with access to classified systems and significant resources orchestrated an elaborate fiction designed to evaluate you specifically." The implications made Sarah's stomach clench. "So whoever contacted me really is operating outside normal government channels." "That's our assessment," Webb confirmed, "which makes your decision even more significant. If you choose to join them, you'll be operating in spaces where normal oversight and accountability don't exist. If you choose not to, you might be the only person who can provide intelligence about their capabilities and intentions." Sarah stared out the room's small window at the unremarkable landscape surrounding the facility. Somewhere out there, her normal life was waiting for her classmates taking midterm exams, professors updating syllabi, Elena probably wondering why her roommate had disappeared without explanation. It felt both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close. "What would you do?" she asked. Webb was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "When I was your age, I thought the most important thing was making choices that would lead to success and security. I wanted a predictable career, a comfortable life, recognition for my achievements." He paused, studying his hands. "It took me years to realize that the most important choices aren't about what you want to become, but about what you're willing to sacrifice to protect the things you care about." "That's not really an answer," Sarah pointed out. "No," Webb agreed, "because it's not really a question I can answer for you. But I will say this, based on what I observed during the test, you have capabilities that could genuinely change the world. The question is whether you trust yourself to use those capabilities responsibly." After Webb left, Sarah spent hours walking the facility's corridors, thinking about responsibility and sacrifice, about the difference between safety and cowardice, about the weight of unused potential. She thought about Dr. Volkov, wherever he was, and the mysterious organization that had demonstrated the ability to orchestrate elaborate fictions involving multiple government agencies. She thought about quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and the digital weapons that would shape the next century of human conflict. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she'd first seen the attack code and recognized it as beautiful. That moment of aesthetic appreciation for mathematical elegance, even in the service of destruction, had revealed something about herself that she was still trying to understand. On the final day of her deliberation period, Sarah was granted permission to make a secure video call to her parents. Seeing their faces on the screen, her father's concerned expression, her mother's barely controlled worry brought home the reality of what her choice would mean for the people who loved her. "We can't discuss the details," Dr. Chen said carefully, clearly having been briefed about what he could and couldn't say. "But we want you to know that whatever you decide, we're proud of you and will support your choice, even if it means we might not see you very often." Dr. Wang Chun added, her voice catching slightly on the words. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the crisis had begun. "I don't know what I'm going to choose yet," she admitted. "But I know that whatever I decide, it won't be because I don't love you or don't want to be part of the family. It'll be because I think it's the right thing to do." Her parents exchanged a look that spoke of decades of marriage and shared understanding. "That's all we've ever wanted," her mother said. "For you to have the courage to do what you think is right, even when it's difficult." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her small room and made her decision. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Colonel Hayes and the senior officials who were managing her case. When they assembled in the same briefing room where she'd first learned about the test, Sarah felt like she was completing a circle that had begun with her frozen moment on Georgetown's campus. "I've made my decision," she announced without preamble. "I'm going to join them." The room erupted in questions and objections, but Sarah held up a hand for silence. "I'm not finished. I'm going to join them, but not on their terms. I'm going to be a double agent." Colonel Hayes leaned forward with sharp attention. "Explain. Whoever orchestrated this test has capabilities that represent a potential threat to national security," Sarah said. "But they also have capabilities that could be used to strengthen our defenses against genuine attacks. I want to work with them to develop quantum cryptographic systems, but I want to do it in a way that serves American interests rather than some unknown agenda." "That's incredibly dangerous," Dr. Reeves pointed out. "If they discover that you've reporting to us, the consequences could be severe." "Everything about this situation is dangerous," Sarah replied. "But I think the risk of doing nothing is worse than the risk of infiltrating their organization. And I think I'm uniquely positioned to succeed, because they expect me to be naive and idealistic." The discussion that followed was intense, involving secure communications with officials at levels of government Sarah hadn't known existed. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of Sarah's proposed course of action. Intelligence specialists assessed the operational risks and potential benefits. Psychologists evaluated her emotional and mental fitness for deep cover work. In the end, the decision was made at levels far above Sarah's pay grade. But the result was communicated to her with startling directness. Her proposal was approved. She would be trained as an intelligence operative, provided with resources and support systems, and then allowed to make contact with the mysterious organization that had tested her. The training that followed was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. She learned about operational security, covert communication, psychological manipulation, and the dozens of skills that intelligence operatives use to survive and succeed in hostile environments. She studied the psychology of recruitment, the techniques that criminal and terrorist organizations use to identify and cultivate assets. Most importantly, she learned to think like someone who was genuinely considering betraying her country. for idealistic reasons. The cover story she would present was that she'd become disillusioned with government oversight and wanted to work with people who shared her vision of using technology to create a more secure world. 6 weeks after her initial recruitment test, Sarah received the contact instructions she'd been waiting for. They came in the form of a seemingly innocent email about a computer science conference in Prague. But embedded in the metadata was a complex cryptographic puzzle. That took her 3 days to solve. The solution led to coordinates for a meeting in a small cafe in Georgetown, less than 2 miles from the university campus where her life had changed forever. The irony wasn't lost on her. She would begin her career as a covert operative in the same neighborhood where she'd been a naive graduate student just weeks earlier. The cafe in Georgetown, where Sarah met her contact, looked exactly like the kind of place where graduate students came to study and academics came to debate theoretical problems over expensive coffee. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the name was probably fake, but the credentials were impressive, looked like a professor of mathematics, which according to Sarah's intelligence briefings, she actually was, or had been, before disappearing from her position at MIT 8 months earlier. "Phoenix," Dr. Vasquez said warmly, as if greeting an old friend rather than initiating contact with a potential recruit. "I'm so pleased you decided to join us." Sarah had rehearsed this moment dozens of times during her training, but the reality was still surreal. She was sitting across from someone who was technically an enemy of the state, someone whose organization had demonstrated the ability to manipulate government agencies and military resources for their own purposes. Yet the woman across from her seemed genuinely committed to using advanced technology for humanitarian purposes. "I still have questions," Sarah said, staying in character as an idealistic graduate student who'd become disillusioned with government oversight. "About what you're really trying to accomplish, about whether I can trust you, about what I'm getting myself into." Dr. Vasquez smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Questions are good. Trust should be earned, not assumed. And what you're getting yourself into is the most important work of the next century, ensuring that the transition to quantum computing strengthens human civilization rather than destroying it." Over the following months, Sarah was gradually introduced to an organization that was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than she'd imagined. They called themselves the Quantum Stability Initiative, and their membership included some of the most brilliant minds in mathematics, physics, and computer science from around the world. Their stated mission was to develop quantum cryptographic systems that would be available to all nations, preventing any single country or organization from achieving decisive advantage in cyber warfare. The work was intellectually stimulating beyond anything Sarah had experienced in academia. She collaborated with researchers who operated at absolute cutting edge of human knowledge, solving problems that wouldn't appear in textbooks for another decade. She helped develop algorithms that could factor prime numbers with millions of digits, encryption systems that were theoretically unbreakable even with unlimited computational resources, and communication protocols that could detect eavesdropping attempts through quantum mechanical principles. It was also deeply morally ambiguous. While the organization's stated goals were admirable, Sarah gradually realized that their true agenda was more complex. They weren't just developing defensive technologies, they were creating weapons systems that could disable entire nations. Digital infrastructure while leaving their own systems protected by quantum encryption. Sarah's intelligence handlers had prepared her for this possibility, but the reality was more challenging than training scenarios had suggested. The people she worked with weren't cartoon villains plotting world domination. They were brilliant, idealistic individuals who genuinely believed they were working to prevent global catastrophe. Their logic was seductive. If responsible actors didn't develop these capabilities first, irresponsible ones inevitably would. 8 months later, the breakthrough came during what the organization euphemistically called Project Lighthouse, an attempt to create a quantum communication network that could coordinate defensive measures across multiple countries simultaneously. Sarah had been working on the encryption protocols, developing algorithms that would allow instantaneous secure communication regardless of physical distance. What she discovered, hidden in the project's deeper architecture, was evidence that Lighthouse wasn't defensive at all. It was designed to create a quantum-controlled network that could override local security systems, effectively giving the organization remote control over any connected infrastructure. Once activated, it would make every participating nation dependent on the organization's goodwill for basic digital services. The revelation came to her gradually, like a puzzle whose individual pieces seemed innocent until assembled into a complete picture. Late one night in the organization's prod facility, a converted Cold War-era communications bunker that had been transformed into a state-of-the-art research center, Sarah found herself staring at code that represented the culmination of everything she'd worked on for months. Dr. Vasquez found her there at 3 a.m, sitting alone in the blue glow of multiple monitors, her face reflecting a mixture of admiration and horror at what she'd helped create. "You see it now," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, settling into a chair beside Sarah's workstation. "The real scope of what we're building." "It's not defensive," Sarah said, not bothering to disguise her accusation. "You're creating the ultimate offensive. Weapon one that lets you control rather than destroy your targets." "Control is preferable to destruction," Dr. Vasquez replied calmly. "Would you rather live in a world where conflicts are resolved through digital manipulation of infrastructure, or one where they're resolved through nuclear weapons and conventional warfare?" Sarah felt the terrible logic of the argument, even as she recognized its fundamental flaw. And who decides when to use this control? Who determines which governments deserve to have their infrastructure compromised? You? Some secret council of scientists who've decided they know better than democratically elected leaders? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a critical assumption. "You're not as naive as I initially thought," she said finally. "No," Sarah agreed, "I'm not." The conversation that followed was one of the most intellectually challenging of Sarah's life. Dr. Vasquez presented arguments for the organization's approach that were sophisticated, well-reasoned, and terrifyingly plausible. She spoke of nation-states that were developing quantum weapons in secret, of terrorist organizations that would soon have access to capabilities that could destroy global communication systems, of the narrow window of opportunity for responsible actors to establish quantum supremacy before irresponsible ones. Sarah countered with arguments about democracy, accountability, and the dangers of uncontrolled power, but she found herself genuinely uncertain about some of the fundamental questions. In a world where digital weapons could cripple entire civilizations overnight, was traditional democratic oversight even possible? Could elected officials who barely understood social media be trusted to make decisions about quantum cryptography? "You have a choice to make," Dr. Vasquez said as their debate wound down. "You can continue working with us, helping to shape how these capabilities are developed and deployed. Or you can walk away, knowing that others will complete the work without your input or oversight." "Those aren't the only options," Sarah replied. Dr. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "What else do you have in mind?" "Transparency," Sarah said. "Real oversight. Democratic participation in decisions about how quantum technologies are developed and deployed. Instead of a secret organization making choices for the world, why not work openly with governments, academic institutions, and international organizations? Because governments are slow, academic institutions are naive, and international organizations are paralyzed by competing interests," Dr. Vasquez replied immediately. "By the time they reach consensus on appropriate frameworks for quantum technology oversight, hostile actors will have developed first-generation quantum weapons and used them to reshape global power structures." Sarah knew she was right. But she also knew that the alternative, allowing a self-appointed group of scientists to control the world's digital infrastructure, was equally unacceptable. The problem was that both approaches seemed to lead to disaster, just by different paths. 1 year later, the crisis that Sarah had been dreading finally arrived on a Tuesday morning that began like any other. She was working on refinements to the lighthouse communication protocols when alarms began sounding throughout the Prague facility. Not the routine alerts that accompanied regular security drills, but the harsh, urgent tones that indicated genuine emergency. Dr. Vasquez appeared in the laboratory doorway with an expression Sarah had never seen before, genuine fear mixed with grim determination. "We need to talk," she said. "Now." The briefing room was already crowded with senior organization members when Sarah arrived. The wall display showed network diagrams that were all too familiar, real attack patterns targeting actual infrastructure systems, spreading with the exponential growth curves that characterized genuine cyber warfare. Chinese military hackers have deployed a quantum attack system against Western financial networks, Dr. Vasquez announced without preamble. Their capabilities are approximately 18 months behind ours, but they're using brute force approaches that we didn't anticipate. Instead of elegant algorithms, they're throwing massive computational resources at quantum decryption problems. Sarah studied the attack patterns, her mind automatically analyzing the mathematical approaches being used. They're not trying to break individual encryption keys, she realized. They're trying to collapse the entire framework that supports modern cryptography. If they succeed, every secure communication system in the world becomes vulnerable. Precisely, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. And they're approximately 6 hours away from achieving decisive breakthrough. Once they can decrypt arbitrary communications in real time, they'll have access to every classified document, every private conversation, every financial transaction in the Western world. The implications were staggering. Sarah thought about her parents, about Alina, about millions of ordinary people whose entire digital lives would become transparent to hostile foreign intelligence services. Bank accounts, medical records, personal communications, government secrets, all of it would be readable by anyone with access to the Chinese quantum system. "What are you proposing?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Immediate deployment of Lighthouse," Dr. Vasquez replied. "We use our quantum control capabilities to disable the Chinese attack system and establish protective protocols for Western networks. It's exactly the scenario we've been preparing for." Sarah felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders. Once again, but this time the stakes were even higher than they'd been during her original recruitment. The organization's quantum control system could indeed stop the Chinese attack, but activating it would also give them unprecedented power over global digital infrastructure. "And after we stop the Chinese attack?" Sarah asked. "What happens to Lighthouse then? Do you just turn it off and pretend it never existed?" Dr. Vasquez's expression suggested that Sarah was being naive. Once quantum control capabilities exist, they can't be uninvented. The question isn't whether someone will use them, but whether they'll be used by people who understand their implications. Around the room, other organization members were nodding in agreement. These were some of the most brilliant minds Sarah had ever encountered, and they were genuinely convinced that their approach represented humanity's best hope for surviving the transition to quantum computing. The fact that they were probably right made the decision even more difficult. Sarah thought about her intelligence training, about the communication protocols that would allow her to contact her handlers and potentially coordinate a government response to the crisis. But government response would take hours or days, and, according to the displays around her, they had less than 6 hours before the Chinese attack succeeded. She thought about democracy, accountability, and oversight, abstract principles that seemed less important when weighed against the immediate reality of hundreds of millions of people whose digital privacy was about to be destroyed by a hostile foreign government. Most of all, she thought about responsibility. Not the responsibility of organizations or governments, but her personal responsibility for the consequences of whatever choice she made in the next few minutes. If we deploy Lighthouse, she said carefully, I want guarantees, written protocols, for how the system will be used, oversight mechanisms to prevent abuse, and plans for eventual transition to democratic control. Dr. Vasquez smiled with something that might have been relief. I was hoping you'd say that. We've actually been working on those protocols, waiting for the right moment to implement them. 2 years later, the congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, government officials, and concerned citizens who were still trying to understand the events that had reshaped global politics over the previous 18 months. Sarah sat at the witness table, sworn to tell the truth about her role in what media had dubbed the quantum crisis and the digital Cold War. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, leaned forward with the intense focus of someone who understood that the questions being asked would influence policy for decades to come. Ms. Chen, in your professional opinion, did the deployment of the Lighthouse system represent the best available option for protecting American digital infrastructure? Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about the events that had unfolded since that desperate morning in Prague. The Chinese quantum attack had been stopped, preventing what intelligence analysts estimated would have been the most devastating intelligence compromise in human history. But Lighthouse remained active, its quantum control capabilities providing unprecedented security for participating nations, while making everyone dependent on the quantum stability initiative's continued cooperation. Senator, Sarah replied, I believe we faced a choice between bad and worse. The Chinese attack would have compromised the digital privacy of every person in the Western world. Lighthouse prevented that catastrophe, but it also created new dependencies and vulnerabilities that we're still learning to manage. And your role as a double agent? Senator Williams continued. Do you believe your intelligence activities served American interests? Sarah thought about the intelligence she'd provided over the months of her infiltration. Information that had allowed government agencies to understand and eventually influence the quantum stability initiative's activities. I believe my role provided crucial insights into capabilities and intentions that would otherwise have remained hidden. Whether that justifies the methods used is a judgment that others will have to make. The hearing continued for hours, covering technical details that most participants barely understood and policy implications that would take years to fully appreciate. Sarah answered questions about quantum cryptography, international law, oversight mechanisms, and the future of digital security with the patience of someone who understood that democratic institutions moved slowly but necessarily. 5 years later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the Georgetown University Computer Science Department, looking out at an auditorium filled with undergraduate students who'd been born into a world where quantum computing was routine rather than revolutionary. She was delivering the annual lecture on cybersecurity ethics, a course that had been established in her honor, but that she'd never been allowed to teach while her security clearance was active. The question that defined my generation, she told the students, was whether advanced technology would strengthen or weaken democratic institutions. We learned that the answer depends less on the technology itself than on how societies choose to govern its development and deployment. In the audience, she could see faces that reminded her of herself at their age, bright, ambitious young people who thought they understood the world they were inheriting. Some of them would probably end up working on problems that would reshape civilization just as she had. She hoped they would be better prepared for the moral complexity of those choices than she had been. After the lecture, Sarah walked across the campus where her life had changed forever. The quad looked the same: Gothic buildings, oak trees, students hurrying between classes with backpacks and coffee cups. But she knew that beneath the familiar surface, everything was different. The networks that connected those buildings, the systems that managed student records, the communication protocols that allowed global collaboration. All of it was protected by quantum encryption systems that she'd helped develop. Her phone buzzed with a message from Elena, now Dr. Elena Vasquez Chen, who taught mathematics at a university in California where quantum computing was integrated into undergraduate curricula. They'd remained friends through everything. Despite the classified nature of much of Sarah's work and the strange circumstances of her disappearance from ordinary academic life. Saw your lecture online, the message read. Still making it look easy, proud of you, Rumi. Sarah smiled, remembering the 19-year-old who'd been more worried about thesis deadlines than global security. That person felt like someone she'd known in another lifetime. But the core concerns remained the same: how to use knowledge responsibly, how to balance individual ambition with social responsibility, how to navigate a world where the most important choices were never simple. 10 years later, the Quantum Security Institute occupied a modern building on the Georgetown campus. Its glass walls and open architecture, deliberately designed to symbolize transparency and accountability. As its founding director, Sarah had insisted that the Institute's work be as open as security considerations allowed, a conscious rejection of the secrecy that had characterized her early career. The Institute's mission was to train the next generation of cybersecurity professionals for a world where quantum computing was ubiquitous. But it also served a deeper purpose, ensuring that young people with exceptional technical capabilities understood the broader implications of their work before they were recruited by organizations with less transparent agendas. Sarah's own office overlooked the quad where Delta Force had landed to recruit her 15 years earlier. Sometimes she would stand at the window during quiet moments, remembering the terrified graduate student who dropped her laptop bag and stumbled into a world of classified facilities and moral complexity. The world had changed dramatically since then. The quantum revolution had indeed reshaped global politics, but not in the catastrophic ways that early analyses had predicted. International agreements governed the development and deployment of quantum weapons. Democratic institutions had adapted to provide oversight for technologies that operated at speeds and scales that made traditional bureaucratic processes inadequate. Most importantly, a new generation of technologists had grown up understanding that their work carried social responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. Not all of the changes had been positive. The concentration of quantum capabilities in a few advanced nations had created new forms of international inequality. Criminal organizations had eventually gained access to quantum technologies, creating security challenges that required constant vigilance. And the fundamental questions about democracy, expertise, and technological governance remained unresolved. But civilization had survived the transition to quantum computing, largely because people like Sarah had been willing to make difficult choices under impossible circumstances. The world was more complex now, but it was also more secure, more transparent, and more democratic than the alternative futures that had seemed possible during those desperate hours in Prague. 20 years later, Sarah's final day as director of the Quantum Security Institute was marked by a ceremony that brought together colleagues from around the world, government officials, academic researchers, and representatives from the international organizations that now governed quantum technology development. The auditorium was filled with people whose careers had been shaped by the frameworks and institutions that Sarah had helped establish. Dr. Marcus Webb, now retired from military service and serving as a senior advisor to the United Nations Cybersecurity Council, delivered the keynote address. His hair was gray now, but his voice still carried the authority that Sarah remembered from their first meeting in a helicopter over Georgetown. 20 years ago, he told the audience, we faced a choice between control and chaos, between democratic oversight and technocratic governance, between transparency and security. The woman we honor today helped us find a path that preserved the best aspects of each alternative while avoiding the worst. Sarah listened from the front row, thinking about the young woman who'd been so certain that knowledge and good intentions were sufficient to solve any problem. Experience had taught her that the world was more complicated than that, but it had also taught her that principled people could indeed make a difference, even when the choices were difficult and the outcomes uncertain. After the ceremony, Sarah walked alone across the Georgetown campus for what she knew might be the last time as a member of its community. She was moving to California, where a new research institute was being established to study the social implications of emerging technologies. At 63, she was looking forward to working on problems that were theoretical rather than immediately practical. Questions about how humanity should govern technologies that didn't yet exist. As she reached the spot where Delta Force had landed all those years ago, Sarah's phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. For a moment, she felt a familiar flutter of concern. After decades in the intelligence community, unexpected communication still triggered professional paranoia. But this message was from a current Georgetown student, someone who'd attended her final lecture and wanted to ask questions about pursuing a career in cybersecurity. The young woman's questions were thoughtful, sophisticated, and eerily similar to the concerns that had driven Sarah's own academic interests at that age. Sarah composed a careful response, offering to meet for coffee to discuss the student's interests and concerns. As she sent the message, she realized that this was probably how the cycle would continue, each generation of technologists learning from their predecessors' experiences while facing new challenges that required fresh approaches and creative solutions. The sun was setting over the Potomac River, casting long shadows across the campus where Sarah's life had been irrevocably changed by a helicopter landing and a conversation with strangers who'd recognized capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. She thought about the path that had led from that moment to this one, about the choices that had shaped not just her own life, but the development of an entire technological revolution. It hadn't been the career she'd planned as a graduate student, but it had been the career that circumstances had demanded. And while she couldn't claim that all of her decisions had been correct, she could honestly say that she'd tried to use her capabilities in service of something larger than personal advancement. As Sarah walked away from Georgetown University, for the final time, she carried with her the knowledge that somewhere in the world, other young people were probably facing choices similar to the ones that had defined her life. She hoped they would be better prepared for those choices than she had been, but she also knew that preparation could only go so far. In the end, the most important decisions would still be made by individuals who had to choose between competing values under impossible circumstances. The digital infrastructure that protected global civilization was more secure than it had ever been, but it remained vulnerable to new threats that emerged with each technological advance. The frameworks for democratic oversight of advanced technologies were stronger than they'd been 20 years earlier, but they continued to evolve in response to challenges that couldn't be fully anticipated. Most importantly, a new generation of technologists understood that their work carried responsibilities that extended far beyond academic achievement or professional success. They'd grown up in a world where the consequences of technological choices were visible and immediate, where the connection between individual capability and social responsibility was impossible to ignore. As Sarah disappeared into the evening crowd of students and faculty, she reflected on the strange trajectory that had taken her from anxious graduate student to international cybersecurity expert to elder stateswoman of quantum technology governance. It had been a life defined by crisis and complexity, but also by the satisfaction of knowing that her work had contributed to humanity's successful navigation of one of the most dangerous technological transitions in history the world would face. New challenges in the years to come: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, space-based weapons, and technologies that hadn't yet been imagined. But the precedents established during the quantum revolution, the institutions created to govern emerging technologies, and the traditions of responsible innovation that had been cultivated over decades would provide frameworks for addressing those future challenges. And somewhere on the Georgetown campus, another young person with exceptional capabilities was probably worrying about thesis deadlines and career choices, completely unaware that their life might be about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. Sarah smiled at the thought, remembering the mixture of terror and excitement that had defined her own recruitment into a world where knowledge was power and power carried inescapable responsibility. The cycle would continue, as it always had, and always would, with each generation of extraordinary individuals, discovering that their gifts came with obligations they hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. It was a burden and a privilege, a source of anxiety and purpose, a reminder that in a world shaped by technology, the most important questions would always be human ones. Sarah Chen had been just a student until Delta Force landed with her call sign on the chopper. What she'd become afterward was someone who'd helped ensure that the future remained worth protecting.